So the sectionalism that we previously saw with the new political parties, the fugitive slave law, which we'll touch upon the greater context here, along with Uncle Tom's Cabin, has another sinister side to it. And, the last act of the triumvirate, the rule of three, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster. This comes about with the Compromise of 1850. And this happens when California actually wrote their own constitution. Because remember, they had so many people come due to the gold rush that they fast-tracked statehood. They gathered and wrote their own constitution banning slavery, and they expected admittance to the Union. Now, as Lincoln later put it, the 73-year-old Henry Clay was regarded by all as the man for a crisis. The struggle over slavery was truly threatening to tear the Union apart. So Henry Clay came up with the last of his compromises. In short, there are three proposals. California would be admitted as a free state, given that it was widely known that they opposed the practice, so this favored the North. The remaining territories from New Mexico would be divided into Utah and New Mexico, and the residents would be allowed to vote on slavery, so that one favored the South. Now, finally, he wanted to end the slave trade in D.C., and that is a little more of a northern attitude, while also strengthening the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793. This is that slave law that we saw previously. And this, famously takes a sectional issue, makes it national. Now, Clay recognized that the North was conceding far more than the South, but he reasoned that the North's objections to slavery were ideological, whereas slavery was integral to Southern life, so the North had nothing tangible to lose. This compromise is truly his last act, and he ends up dying 2 years later, attempting to save the Union. So that ends Henry Clay. John C. Calhoun was too weak to physically respond to the compromise, so he handed his speech to a fellow senator from Virginia to read. He argued that secession was the sole option, unless the North conceded to the South the right to bring slavery into every section of the Union, to stop agitating on slavery, and to amend the Constitution to balance free and slave states. Calhoun would die within the month. Now, 1 month after Calhoun's final speech was read, Daniel Webster spoke, and he stunned everyone by coming out in favor of all of Clay's proposals. Webster earned the scorn of abolitionists for this, but he too would die the same year as Henry Clay. So all three men would not live to see the results of their efforts. Whig President Zachary Taylor threatened to veto the compromise, but he actually fell ill after a 4th of July party and died shortly after. The new president, Millard Fillmore, was more conservative, and he really had no qualms about allowing the law to pass. Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas split up all sections to be voted on separately. He was very shrewd about this. Most Northerners abstained from the Southern laws, and most Southerners abstained on the so-called Northern laws. So the compromise really came from Ohio River Valley legislators. Douglas referred to it as a final settlement on slavery, and he urged his colleagues to stop the debate, drop the subject. Case closed. Except a few years later, it opens up again with what was called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. All right, so the genesis of this act can be traced back to that same senator, Stephen Douglas, the so-called Little Giant, who dreamed of a transcontinental railroad that he hoped would go through Chicago, turning it into a national hub and benefiting his home state. Southerners were concerned that at least 2 states would be carved from the Nebraska Territory, and they would forbid slavery under the Missouri Compromise. But they also wanted a southern route for the railroad because they wanted economic independence. Douglas had proposed multiple routes, but none of them could be secured until statehood was granted for these territories, so that the railroads could actually get the land. Douglas used the language of the Compromise of 1850 to provide for what was called popular sovereignty. The people vote on it. Southerners further wanted the lands to be broken up into Kansas, which is, geographically next to Missouri, so likely a slave state, even though cotton can't grow there. And then Nebraska was to the north, and that would most likely be free. Douglas really wanted this railroad, so he obliged. And this means that the Missouri Compromise, because people are allowed to vote on this, the Missouri Compromise is at least philosophically repealed. Now the Southerners are mildly pleased with themselves, but the Northerners were infuriated. Douglas defended the bill as allowing for democracy, but former Whig Congressman Abraham Lincoln would give speeches denouncing the extension of slavery into American territories. The reality was that pro- and anti-slavery forces streamed into Kansas to influence the vote on slavery, and they did so illegally. A pro-slavery territorial legislature was elected because 1,200 Missourians ended up casting 5,000 ballots. And the anti-slavery forces boycotted the process. Now, half of the total votes cast were illegal. And when the Free Staters in the assembly were expelled, they actually formed their own government. So by November of 1855, Kansas has two governments. Now, clear violence began to break out on American soil. In May of 1856, pro-slavery forces fired artillery into the Free State stronghold of Lawrence, and the town suffered heavy damage. The Eastern press proclaimed it the sack of Lawrence and escalated tensions. Armed clashes between the two sides soon followed, and Bleeding Kansas was the nickname given to this time frame. So the Compromise of 1850 lays the groundwork for popular sovereignty, and that's the justification for allowing the residents of Kansas and Nebraska to vote, even though most of the votes were cast illegally and the actual residents of these areas cared more about land. Slavery was not a huge concern. Now, fighting in western areas is one thing, but when that fighting spills over into Congress, it's a whole other ballgame. News began to spread that Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina had viciously attacked Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner on the Senate floor. And Sumner had been giving an anti-slavery speech, and Sumner himself will be staunchly abolitionist through the Civil War up through Reconstruction, and he used the typical literary and historical references against admitting Kansas as a slave state. Now that's all well and good, but he then began to personally attack Senator Douglas and Andrew Butler of South Carolina, and these two men wrote the Kansas and Nebraska Act, but he served his most savage criticism at Butler. Now, Butler was elderly, and he talked with a lisp, and the remarks were widely condemned as unfair. A Michigan senator even called the speech un-American and unpatriotic, and it was really widely believed that he had acted unprofessional. 2 days later, Representative Preston Brooks, who was the younger cousin of Butler, entered the Senate chamber with a heavy cane. He walked up to Sumner and claimed, "You have libeled South Carolina and my relative, and I have come to punish you." Sumner was beaten over the head repeatedly with the cane, and he was carried out of the Senate chamber unconscious, and the severe injuries to his brain and spinal cord actually kept him out of the Senate for the next 3 years. So he didn't physically reclaim his seat right up until the eve of the Civil War. Now, Brooks was praised throughout the South, and the Richmond Whig proclaimed, "We are rejoiced at this." In the North, the message is clear. If a powerful senator is treated like this, what hope do slaves have? So with order breaking down in the nation's largest lawmaking body, it's clear that war is going to be imminent.